The ad on the bulletin board at the feed store said summer hand wanted, room and board included, must not be afraid of early mornings. Nothing about roommates, nothing about beds. I want to make that clear right up front because everything that happened that summer started with a piece of paper that left out the one detail that mattered most. My name's Jonah. I was 24 that year, between semesters of a vet tech program I was paying for out of pocket, and I needed money badly enough that I called the number on that flyer from the parking lot before I'd even finished reading it twice. The rancher who answered was a man named Dale Whitfield, gruff over the phone in a way that made me nervous, and he told me to come by the next morning at 6 sharp if I was serious. I was serious. I drove 90 minutes out to his place before sunrise with a duffel bag and a granite kind of determination not to screw this up, because rent was due in 3 weeks and my checking account had exactly $411 in it. Dale Whitfield turned out to be about 60, withered the way men get when they've spent their whole life outdoors, and he walked me around the property, pointing out the barn, the equipment shed, the fence line that needed mending on the north side. He talked fast and expected you to keep up. About 15 minutes into the tour, a guy came out of the barn leading a horse by its halter, and Dale said without breaking stride, "That's my son Colt, he runs most of the day now. You'll answer to him more than me." Colt Whitfield looked up, saw us, and lifted his chin in this small, acknowledging way that wasn't quite a smile. He had his dad's build but none of his gruffness in his face, more of a careful, watchful expression, like he was still deciding what to make of me. "New hand," he called over. "If he lasts the week," Dale said, which I later learned was his idea of a joke, though it took me a solid month to figure that out because he said everything in the exact same flat tone. That first handshake with Colt is honestly not that memorable to me now, which surprises people when I tell this story because they expect some lightning bolt moment. It wasn't like that. He had a firm, brief grip, calloused palm, said welcome aboard, and went right back to the horse. I remember thinking he seemed tired. I remember thinking nothing else about it at all. The room and board part of the deal turned out to mean the bunkhouse, a small building set off from the main house that used to sleep 4 ranch hands back when the Whitfields ran a bigger operation. These days it was just Colt living out there, his dad having moved back into the main house after Colt's mother passed a few years earlier, and the arrangement of who lived where got rearranged. Dale walked me out to the bunkhouse himself that first evening, carrying my duffel bag before I could tell him I had it, and when we got inside he gestured at the single bed pushed against the far wall. "That's the only bed set up right now," he said. "Had a pipe burst in the second room back in the spring, water damage got into the frame and the mattress, both haven't gotten around to replacing it yet. You'll be bunking with Colt till I get that sorted." I stood there in the doorway with my duffel bag, genuinely unsure I'd heard him right. "Sorry, I'll be sharing," Dale said, like it was the most unremarkable thing in the world, a scheduling detail and nothing more. "It's a full bed, plenty of room, and Colt doesn't snore near as bad as his mother did, God rest her." Then he set my bag down at the foot of the bed and walked back out toward the main house, leaving me standing there with my heart doing something complicated in my chest. Colt came in about 20 minutes later, smelling like hay and sweat and the particular mineral smell of a barn, and stopped short when he saw me sitting on the edge of what I now understood was going to be our bed. "He didn't tell you," Colt said. "It wasn't a question." He looked more embarrassed than anything, rubbing the back of his neck. "He mentioned it about 4 seconds before he left," I said. "I'm still catching up. I told him he needed to warn people ahead of time. He never does. Figures if it's not a big deal to him, it shouldn't be a big deal to anybody." Colt sat down on the opposite side of the bed to pull his boots off, careful to keep his back mostly to me, and I noticed the tips of his ears had gone a little red. "I can take the floor if it's weird for you. Got a sleeping bag around here somewhere." "It's fine," I said, faster than I meant to, and then had to sit with the fact that I'd basically volunteered to share a bed with a man I'd known for 11 hours. "I mean, if you don't mind, it's fine. I'm not picky. I slept on a lot of couches in college." He gave me this look sideways, like he was trying to figure out if I actually meant it or was just being polite the way people are when they don't want to make a fuss. "All right," he said finally, "but say something if it's weird. I don't want you lying awake all summer being uncomfortable and never telling me." That was, if I'm honest, the first time I really looked at him. Not just clocked his face the way you do with anybody new, but actually looked, the way you look at someone once you realize they said something kinder than they had to. I want to skip ahead a little here because the first 2 weeks were mostly just work. Brutal early mornings, mending fence in 90-degree heat, learning which horses bit and which ones didn't, and figuring out an entirely new rhythm of sleeping 4 feet away from a man I was, very inconveniently, starting to notice in ways that had nothing to do with ranch work. He kept to his side of the bed like it had a fence of its own. Some mornings I'd wake up and find he'd already left for chores, the sheets cool where he'd been, and other mornings I'd wake up to find we'd both drifted toward the middle in our sleep, shoulders almost touching, and I'd lie there very still, doing math in my head about how long I could stay like that before it got weird if he woke up. The thing that actually shifted something between us wasn't romantic at all, it was a storm. Third week of June, a bad one rolled through, the kind with sideways rain and a tornado watch that had all three of us, Dale included, out checking on the horses at 11 at night with flashlights, making sure the barn doors were secure. By the time we got back to the bunkhouse, we were both soaked through, adrenaline still running, and the power had gone out across the whole property. "Generators for the well pump and the fridge," Colt said, toweling off his hair in the dark. "Not for lights, we'll just have to sit tight till it passes." We sat on the bed because there wasn't really anywhere else dry to sit, both of us still a little keyed up from the storm, and somewhere in the middle of talking about nothing. Whether the fence on the north side would hold, whether his dad's knee was going to act up from being out in the wet, I noticed he'd gone quiet in a different way. Not tired, just thinking about something. "You okay?" I asked. "Storms mess with me a little," he admitted, which clearly cost him something to say. "My mom died during a storm like this. Not from the storm, her heart just gave out, but it was raining like this, and I've never quite separated the two things in my head since." I didn't say anything smart or comforting. I just sat there next to him in the dark, and after a minute I put my hand on his knee, not thinking too hard about it, just wanting him to know somebody was there. He looked down at my hand and then up at me, and something in his face changed, opened up in a way I hadn't seen from him yet. "Nobody out here really talks to me about her," he said. "Dad can't, it hurts him too much, so we just don't." "You can talk to me about her," I said. "Any time, I've got nothing but time out here apparently." He laughed, a small broken sound, and told me about her that night, about how she used to sing off key on purpose to make him laugh when he was little, how she kept every single one of his grade school report cards in a shoebox that Dale still had somewhere in a closet and neither of them could bring themselves to open. I listened. That's mostly what I did that night. Listened and kept my hand on his knee, and somewhere in the middle of it he shifted just slightly closer, close enough that our shoulders were touching and neither of us moved away. We fell asleep like that eventually, sitting up against the headboard, and I woke around 4 with a crick in my neck and Colt's head on my shoulder, and I lay there in the gray almost dawn, not daring to move a muscle, terrified of breaking whatever this was before I even understood what it was. Nothing happened that night if you're waiting for something to happen, but something shifted anyway, some quiet gear turning over between us, and the next few weeks were different after that. Smaller distance in the bed. Longer conversations after chores, sitting out on the porch of the bunkhouse with 2 beers, talking about things that had nothing to do with ranching. He told me about a girl he dated in high school that he'd tried to make himself feel something real for and couldn't, and how confused that had left him for years. I told him about my own confusion, coming out to my parents at 19 to a reaction so awkwardly neutral it had taken me years to realize it wasn't actually acceptance, just avoidance dressed up as tolerance. "They still don't ask about anyone I date," I told him one night on the porch, beer sweating in my hand. "Not because they're against it, just because they don't know how to bring it up. They don't, it's its own kind of loneliness." "That's worse in a way," Colt said. "At least anger you can push back against, silence you can't argue with." I hadn't ever thought about it that way, and I remember looking at him and thinking, not for the first time, that he understood things about being quietly unseen that most people never had to learn. The kiss, when it finally happened, was almost embarrassingly undramatic, which I've come to think is actually the truest thing about it. We'd been up late helping a mare through a difficult foaling, exhausted in that specific bone-deep way physical labor gives you, and we walked back to the bunkhouse at nearly 3 in the morning covered in mud and straw and adrenaline, both of us giddy with relief that the foal had made it. We were laughing about something, I genuinely don't even remember what, some dumb thing Colt said about the foal's wobbly first steps, and he turned to say something else and I just kissed him, mid-sentence. No build-up, no dramatic pause, just 4 months of quiet accumulation finally tipping over. He went very still for a second and my whole body flooded with the specific horror of thinking I'd misjudged everything, and then he kissed me back, hand coming up to the side of my face, both of us still smelling like the barn, both of us too tired to be careful about it. I've been trying to figure out for like 3 weeks how to bring this up, he said when we finally broke apart, forehead against mine, both of us breathing a little unsteady. Keep chickening out. You could have just said something, I said. Could've, didn't, he laughed, short and disbelieving, like he still couldn't quite believe it had happened. You're the one that actually did it. Only because I was too tired to think it through first. Best decision you ever made while sleep-deprived, he said and kissed me again, slower this time, less about relief and more about wanting. I wish I could tell you everything was smooth sailing after that, but the truth is more complicated, and I think the complicated part matters more than the easy part. Dale found out about 3 weeks later, not by catching us doing anything, just by being a perceptive man who noticed his son had started smiling more, noticed the particular way I said Colt's name, noticed we'd stopped even pretending there was any real question about which side of the bed was whose. He never made a big announcement about it. He just started including me in more conversations that were clearly meant for family, asked my opinion on things that weren't really my business to have opinions about. Until one evening at dinner he said, apropos of nothing, "You planning on sticking around past the summer, Jonah, or is this a seasonal thing?" I looked at Colt. Colt looked at his plate. "I've got school in the fall," I said carefully. "Vet tech program I was only ever signed on through August." Dale nodded slowly, chewing, thinking. "Shame," he said. "Place runs better with two good hands on it instead of one, and my son's been easier to be around this summer than he has been in about 3 years, in case neither of you noticed that yourselves." That was it. That was his entire acknowledgement of what was happening between his son and me, delivered across a dinner table over pot roast, gruff and sideways and completely unmistakable in what it actually meant. Colt went red to the tips of his ears again, same as that first night, and mumbled something about needing to check on the horses and got up from the table too fast. I found him out by the corral a while later, leaning on the fence, staring at nothing in particular. "You okay?" I asked, echoing that first storm night question back at him. "He's never talked about my dating life, not once, not with the girl in high school, not with anybody since." Colt's voice was rough. "And the first time he does, it's about you, it's about this. I don't know why that's making me want to cry, but it is." I stood next to him at the fence, not touching him, giving him the room he clearly needed. Maybe because it means something different coming from him when it's real. I said maybe he could tell the other stuff wasn't. Maybe. He wiped at his eyes fast, embarrassed, and laughed at himself. "God, I'm not usually like this. I don't mind you like this." He looked over at me then, something raw and unguarded in his face that I hadn't seen since that storm night, and said, "What happens in August, Jonah? I've been trying not to think about it, but Dad just put it right there on the table and now I can't not think about it." I didn't have a good answer for him that night. I want to be honest about that because I think the honest version matters more than a pretty one. I told him I didn't know that my program was 90 minutes away, that I had no idea how to make any of this work logistically, and he nodded and said that was fair, and neither of us said anything else about it for the rest of the night, just stood at that fence until the sky started going gray. We didn't solve it that night. I think it's important to say that clearly, because most of these stories wrap that part up too fast, too neat, and it wasn't like that for us. The rest of July was good and also strange, both of us aware of a clock running down in the background of everything, both of us trying not to let it poison the good parts while also not able to fully ignore it either. What actually happened in the end is smaller and less cinematic than you might expect. My vet tech program had a satellite campus. It turned out, 40 minutes from the ranch instead of 90, one I hadn't even known existed until my academic advisor mentioned it almost as an afterthought during a phone call in early August. I called Colt from the parking lot of my old campus, hands shaking a little, and told him, and there was this long silence on the line before he said, voice thick, "Say that again. I want to make sure I heard you right." I said it again. "So you're staying," he said. "I'm staying, not in the bunkhouse forever. Obviously, I'll need my own place eventually, but I'm not 90 minutes away. I'm 40, that's nothing, that's a commute." He didn't say much else on the phone, he just said, "Okay. Okay, good," in this rough, cracked voice, and told me he had to go check on a horse, which we both understood was code for needing a minute to himself before he came apart on the phone. That was 2 years ago now. I finished the program at the satellite campus, and I did eventually get my own apartment about 20 minutes from the ranch, not because things went wrong between Colt and me, but because even the best relationship needs its own bed sometimes. its own space to grow into rather than just fitting into whatever room happens to be available. Dale still calls me most weeks asking if I can come help with something, always some flimsy pretext, and I always go, and Colt's always somehow free that same afternoon, which fools absolutely nobody. We still have that bunkhouse bed actually. Dale never did fix the water damage in the second room. Colt asked him about it once, half joking, and Dale just said, wasn't in any hurry to fix something that was working out fine as it was, and went back to whatever he was doing in that flat, unreadable way of his that I've come to understand means more than it lets on. I think about that bulletin board flyer sometimes, the one that never mentioned the room sharing part, the one detail that would have changed the whole shape of that summer if Dale had just written it down. I used to think it was an oversight. Now I'm not so sure. I think maybe some part of him already knew his son needed somebody in that bunkhouse who'd actually stay, actually listen, actually notice the particular quiet of a man who'd learned to carry his grief alone. And maybe he figured the easiest way to make that happen was to just leave the details out and let two exhausted, sleep-deprived people figure the rest out for themselves. Whatever the reason, I'm glad he left it off. I think about that storm sometimes, sitting in the dark with Colt's head on my shoulder, both of us too raw and tired to perform anything for each other, and how that's really where it started, not with anything dramatic, just two people finally letting each other see the parts they usually kept hidden. Some nights out at the ranch, we still end up on that porch with 2 beers watching the horses in the far pasture, and I catch him looking at me sideways sometimes, the exact same look he gave me that very first night, trying to figure out if something's real or just polite. I always tell him the same thing now that I told him then. It's real, it's fine, say something if it ever feels weird, and I promise I will too, and until then, I'm not going anywhere.